But I was thinking about Cardinals players that, need to, if this team's going to be what it can be, and by the way, this means us just looking at the roster as it is. This isn't about, well, they're going to need to go out and get this. I'm talking about the people they already have. And there's quite a few of them that are candidates for what you might call comeback seasons, bounce back seasons, whatever you want to call it. I think you know what I mean. Guys who were disappointing last year in one way or the other. Maybe it's just nothing more than injuries. But what about 2023? Which of these guys will bounce back? And so I put them together in order, like the likelihood of a strong bounce back season. I kind of ranked them 1 through 9. And this may surprise some people, or maybe not, but number 1 on my list, and I feel pretty strongly about it, is Tyler O'Neill. And like I said when I wrote this thing, it's like y'all can blast me later if I'm wrong. But for the first time ever, Tyler O'Neill and his off-season regimen is dramatically different. And I think it's going to pay off, and it's going to limit his injuries in 2023. He's prioritized stretching, running, sprinting. He's doing yoga. Everything's about being limber, being flexible. And he's got a specific program designed to keep his hamstrings loose. He never did this stuff before. So that flexibility is a positive development. And I like what O'Neill told Derek Gould back in early December. He said, talking about, in effect, getting back to where he was in 2021. It starts by staying consistently on the field. There's no question about it. I'm not concerned if my performance will be there or my skill set if I can stay on the field, stay in a rhythm. That's how I help the Cardinals win ball games. That's the kind of players I am. Step 1, stay on the field, stay healthy. Now, we can criticize him for taking too long to realize that. I would actually prefer to criticize the people that should be supervising getting him looser and more flexible all along, which apparently wasn't done. But let's just put that aside and worry about 2023 right now. And, I always back it up with numbers. And one thing I did, so I'm going to look, each month of his career, and I'm going to see what has happened. Is there correlation between playing time and actually the quality of his performance? In other words, when he has been healthy to stay in the lineup, stay on the field, what have been the results? So I looked at the 5 months in his career, the 5 different months in his career where he's had his highest number of plate appearances. And in those 5 months, if you roll all of those numbers together, the 5 months that he's played the most individually, but you roll them together for our accounting purposes here, he's performed about 30% above league average offensively. His slugging percentage ranges from .462 on the low end, which is good, all the way up to .731 at the top end. He never, in the 5 months where he played the most because he was healthy enough to play a lot, none of those months were poor or mediocre or even average. They were good months, very good months, or exceptional months. So the point is, the more he can play, his history tells us the more he delivers offensively. Some of that is obvious because if you have the more at-bats you have, the more home runs you'll have. But just because it's obvious, don't miss the point. That's the point is that there's been too many months where he hasn't had enough at-bats because he's hurt. But when he's been able to stay in there, he's a really consistent producer. And then, of course, in 2021, he played more than he ever had, 137 games, 537 plate appearances, and he even was on the IL a couple times that year, but it wasn't anything too serious. So naturally, he had his best year, 34 homers, he hit .286, 352 on base, .560 slug, .912 OPS. He was 48% above the league average offensively, 48%. Because he was out there. And the more he plays, the more he swings the bat, the more of a rhythm he has, the more consistent he gets. So there's a strong correlation there, whether people want to deny it or not. It's factually proven. And that's why I like his chances of having a strong bounce back, because this first off season where he's done all that he could prepare to defeat the thing that has held him back more than anything, having to limp off and go to the injured list. The other thing, you've heard me talk about this, his mind is clear. That was not the case a year ago. A year ago, his new agent, Scott Boras, primed him for a battle. They disrespect you. They're not offering you enough money. We're going to take them to arbitration court, And O'Neill got all caught up in it. And they got into a protracted, legal arbitration battle with the Cardinals. And O'Neill fought him, man. And he lost the arbitration, and it messed up his head. When the season began, he did hit a home run in the first game, but for the first month of last season, he hit 188. And that home run on opening day was the only home run he hit in April. And I don't think he hit too many in May either. And he also struck out 20 times in 69 at-bats. So, if the big fella can stay out of the training room and off the IL, I'm really confident he's going to have a heck of a year. Because that's exactly what happened. Well, for the most part, because he did get hurt a little. But that's exactly what happened in 2021. He was phenomenal. Won a second Gold Glove. Numbers were terrific. Hit 34 homers. Got MVP votes. Really good stuff. He's just got to stay on the field. Let's get to our guest line. My friend Rick Hummel is with us. As always, look forward to talking to the commish every Friday around this time. Commish, what's new since we last had a chance to gab?
Well, Scotty Rowland got in by the hair of his chinny chin chin in the Hall of Fame there by 5 votes. Doesn't matter how many elections or how many votes you got in. He's in. Good for him.
I asked our mutual friend John Denton this yesterday. Look, and I'm familiar with the wins above replacement and all that. And if you look at Ken Boyer, he's down on the list a little bit. I'm just saying that's the reality of the situation. It doesn't mean I don't think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. But do you think Rowland getting in, a guy who didn't necessarily have this big, huge pile of counting stats because injuries kind of reduced the amount of time he could play, like literally in a season, late in his career, it was like three or four seasons out of 5 where he didn't even have enough at-bats to qualify. Do you think a guy like Ken Boyer would get a closer look because there are different ways to evaluate players, and I think some of those different ways really helped Rowland. What's your take on this? Because I really appreciate your historical perspective.
Well, as you know, I've been fighting this fight for 20 years to get him a better look than he's been getting. He's been on the ballot for some of those veterans elections, and he doesn't compute. He's been 3 or under every year, and he's been on probably 3 or 4 of them. And now that era, that revised era, he's now in the era of anybody who played before 1980 is going to come up here another year or so. Well, he did, but so did 1,000 other guys play in that era.
Yeah.
His WAR, I looked up the other day, is 62.8. That's pretty good, I think.
It is really good.
I'm going to tell anybody who asks me that I'm one of the few guys who actually saw both these guys play with a lot. I didn't see Boyer play a lot, but I saw him play enough. I saw Rowland play a lot. And Rowland was no better player than Ken Boyer. They're both really good players. Boyer won an MVP. He had Gold Gloves, not quite as many as Rowland. I think he had more hits, or a legitimate number of hits anyway. He hit one of the biggest home runs in Cardinal history, that grand slam off Al Downing in the 4th inning of Game 4 of the 1964 series. He kind of flip-flopped that series where the Cardinals won it against a Yankee team that was the last go-round for the Yankees. They were fading, and then they faded completely after that. And CBS decided to buy him. That was a good idea. And anyway, I don't think there's a big difference or any difference. I think Rowland, to answer your question, Rowland getting in should help Kenny Boyer. But I'm going to need some more people on my side here, and I've been able to muster that posse so far.
Well, I was looking at some of the numbers last night, and one thing I zeroed in on, and listen, it doesn't mean that everybody who votes or even fans who have opinions on who should go in or not, but my friend Jay Jaffe, who just is so diligent about analyzing this Hall of Fame stuff and totally objective, and he's a good guy, he developed that JAWS system, and one of the things is like he measures players like, okay, what are their let's look at their 7-year peaks, the best 7-year stretch they had, because sometimes that'll tell you a lot whether a guy should be in or not. And Roland's 7-year peak was above the average for Hall of Fame third baseman. Ken Boyer, his 7-year peak was slightly above Roland's. So, that's just another thing you can kind of put in there. His 7-year peak was outstanding. And then you know more about this than me. Much like Roland, he was kind of limited, and some of his effectiveness later on was reduced by injuries. It kind of watered things down a little bit. But if you look at his peak seasons, Ken Boyer stands very well among third basemen.
Well, and on some really good Cardinal teams in the early to mid-'60s, including Stan Musial, Bill White, Kurt Flood, Dick Grote, Ken Boyer, of course, Lou Brock.
Kurt Flood there for a while?
Ken Boyer was the captain.
Yep.
He was the captain. He was the official captain, and he was the unofficial captain. That was his ball club. Because Stan had pretty much ceded the torch to him at that point. And then they won in '64, and Boyer had a monster year, drove in way over 100 runs, MVP. And Roland, finished in the top 13 of MVP one time. I mean, he was a really good player. But so was Kenny Boyer, darn it. And the worst thing that happened to him, in several ways, was the fact that he died way too soon. He died in his 50s.
Yeah.
Cancer. And a lot of voters never saw him play. That's too bad, because he was pretty good.
Commissioner, I hate to put you on the spot because I can't remember this, or I don't know this is a better way to put it. What year did his time on the baseball writers ballot end, Ken Boyer?
Well, let's see. I think he played. I don't think he got to the 70s. So let's say 75. It surely ended around 1990 or so. And he's been on several, veterans committees, and the people that I work with in Cooperstown. I'm on one of these other committees that looks at the players overlooked, perhaps, or the oversight committee, as it were, and they're getting tired of hearing me talk about them, but they're going to get another chance here.
And I just did a quick search, and I don't have that specific answer, but I'm really surprised to see that his highest percentage of vote was like 22.9%. And, that was I lost this here. I think it was 1988. No, it's 25.5%, pardon me, in 1988. So that's really surprising. I mean, I would have bet you $50 that maybe he at some point at least got into the 50s or something,
Well, in those days, you didn't see guys rising 66 points in 5 years like Roland did
right.
without playing a game. I don't know how that happened. I mean, he must have really had some good years, and we weren't paying attention there.
I think it was ballot. I think that ballot thinned out. You got all those. Remember, how some of the newer voters were really rallying around Bonds and Clemens and Schilling, who wasn't a steroids guy but a controversial guy, and then even Sosa. Those guys took up a lot. They ate up a lot of votes. I think a lot of it had to be with just finally clearing those guys off that ballot. This one was kind of more wide open, don't you think?
Good point.
Yeah.
There were a lot of really good players on this ballot. How many Hall of Famers were on there? I would have to say, I think Beltran is a Hall of Famer, and he had a nice start at 40-some-odd%. I think Billy Wagner's a Hall of Famer.
I do too.
I think Todd Helton's a Hall of Famer. And I think Jeff Kent is a Hall of Famer, and he was 10 and out this year at right at 40%, I think, or maybe even a little bit under, and he has the home run record for second baseman. That's all he ever did, and he caught every ball that he got his glove on, just like Sandberg.
That's right.
Was he as agreeable to Sandberg to talk to? Well, no. One was like talking to Sandberg, one was like talking to sandpaper.
It's a good line. Good line, Commish. Yeah, no, I'm a Kent guy too, but I agree with Jason Stark, Tom Verducci, and others, and you, because I'm sure you would agree. You would sign on with the opinion that one of these committees will get him in fairly soon.
Well, I would hope so. He has to be off for a few years, and then we haven't mentioned. I don't know if it's the elephant in the room or not, but can anybody tell me whether they think Scott Rowland was a better player than Jim Edmonds? I mean, weren't they pretty much equal?
I think it's an excellent question.
And Jim Edmonds got 2.5% of the vote. 2.5,
which is unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me.
And he have to get 5 for our listeners, 5 to stay on. And Rowland got 10 the first year, which ensured he was going to stay on for the duration of the 10 years. Edmonds got 2.5. And now he won't be able to be considered. I think his 10 years might be up in 25 the next time that comes around. I would think so. You have to spend those other 9 years on the ballot. You weren't even on it anymore as punishment. You don't go from being knocked off the ballot to the Veterans Committee right away. You have to wait, like Simmons had to wait 14 years to even be considered again. And they knocked it down to 10 years now for 9 in Edmonds' case, 9 more. That should be just about over. But I think they were equal players. Both home run hitters, both hit around 280 for their careers, I guess, and won as many Gold Gloves as the other did, and were equally as important to the Cardinals' rise in the mid 2000s as anybody else, other than Albert.
Right. If you look at Edmonds, well, first of all, there's a couple follow-up points to this. And one of them would take too long to explain, but maybe I'll write about this. You gave me an idea. Maybe I'll write and talk about this, prepare something next week. The center field position, I'm talking about pure center fielders. To me, it's really unrepresented. Now, you had some of the all-time greats that were filed away a long time ago. Mays, Cobb, Speaker, Mantle, Griffey Jr., DiMaggio. I'm giving people kind of an idea that, people that got in a long time ago. But, again, I can't put an exact number on it, but over the last 50 years or so, the center field position has been pretty ignored as far as representation in the Hall of Fame. And to me, that's where a guy like Jim Edmonds should have more of a case, because he, if you cut it off at a certain date, as far as like when the center fielder played, if you just compare him to people of his own time, I mean, he was easily one of the very best center fielders, both two ways, with his Gold Gloves, with his power, with his on-base percentage. I mean, is he Willie Mays? No, nobody is. I mean, is he Mickey Mantle? No, nobody is. But he had a damn good career, and for him to drop off after the first year is ridiculous.
He darn sure is as good as Andrew Jones, who had more home runs, but they both won a whole bunch of Gold Gloves. And Andrew Jones had a whole lot of years where he didn't hit for average at all.
Right.
And Edmonds got 2%, and Andrew Jones is in the 40s or 50s. Right? I don't think Andrew Jones is 50% better than Jim Edmonds is.
No. For whatever it's worth, Jim Edmonds sort of just that his wins above replacement, which you can disregard, but his counting stats are really good. But he's like 15th among center fielders all time. Now, if you're just as a matter of principle, if you're 15th in the history of the game at your position, maybe people can quibble about, well, I'm not sure if he's a Hall of Famer. Okay, that's a discussion. But to be one of the top 15 guys that ever play your position, and you get 2.5% of the vote, and that's it, you're done? Jeez. That's pretty harsh.
Yeah, and then when those guys do get into the Veterans Committees, as Ed Simmons found out, you're in the room with these Hall of Famers, and they ask you, well, how did he do in the regular voting? Well, he lasted only one election. Oh, they go, whoa. They raise their eyebrows. You must not have liked this guy very much. What are you going to say to that? A lot of us didn't like him, according to the stats. Simmons got to 3.7% the only time he was on the ballot, and then he missed 14 years. And Edmonds, we've already, discussed. But when they see that the writers didn't give him much cachet either, they're thinking, well, I didn't see much of him play. Maybe he's not as good as some other people think he is.
Right.
Which is wrong.
That's exactly right. Hopefully Boyer will get a fair hearing. By the way, I don't think he'd mind me mentioning this commission, mutual friend of ours and a longtime colleague of ours. I'm just going to call him the Rooster, Mike Smith. He said, Ron Santo is in, Ken Boyer should be in, period. He wanted me to pass that along to you.
Well, I've been saying that for a long time, and they were both excellent players. But Boyer was better because he could run. He had speed. Santo did not have speed. He lacked one of the tools of a great player, Santo, was speed.
Do you I'm looking off in the distance a little bit. I mean, there's no doubt Albert Pujols is going to be a Hall of Famer. I would assume that about Molina, but I have seen some dissent along those lines. Why that is, I'm not sure, because the only thing, even if you go along with the fancy pants stats, wins above replacement, the only area of wins above replacement where it really hurt his case is that, he was he graded out as a real minus as a base runner. So if you got one of the two or three all-time great defensive catchers who in his peak years actually was a really important offensive player for the Cardinals, but everyone agrees that this is a legendary defensive catcher, and you're going to keep him out of the Hall of Fame because he was a slow base runner? That doesn't seem very logical to me.
No. The only reason he might not be elected quickly, like say the first ballot, he comes on the same year as Albert. So I don't think both those guys are going to make it in the same year. I think that's not going to happen. They're not going to have Molina won't be on his coattails, but he might be leading candidate for the next year. And speaking of catchers, people are talking about next year Beltre comes on the ballot and so forth. What about Joe Mauer? Won 3 batting titles as a catcher.
And he was an MVP as a catcher, too, a league MVP. I saw a breakdown. I can't pop it up on my laptop right now because I have to search for it, but I saw a breakdown of his offensive value and what he did as a catcher, because a lot of people try to ding him, or at least some people try to ding him. It's like, well, wait a minute, he moved to first base. He still spent a lot of time at catcher, and when he was a catcher, his numbers were phenomenal, and his defense was considered outstanding. So I can't see a reason to not. I won't be voting, but I couldn't see a reason to not vote for him.
I mean, catchers do get hurt. That's why he moved to first base.
That's right.
He couldn't handle. I mean, he tried. He caught probably 8-10 years, and then he played first base and whatever else the rest of the time. But 3 batting titles as a catcher is enough for me. And he played on some good Twins teams. Unfortunately, they kept playing the Yankees every year in the playoffs, and that didn't work out well. So I hope he does well. I hope he gets in next year.
He had 5 Silver Sluggers as a catcher too. That's pretty notable. Yeah, he's
a lot of 35 and 40 home run years. No, that wasn't his style.
Is there another guy who I'm trying to think? We had a recent conversation. You thought that like Torrey Hunter should at least got more support than he did. Like maybe not a Hall of Famer, but you were surprised that his name never came up.
Well, I don't see a lot of difference between him and Andruw Jones except the amount of home runs. But they were both taking balls back from over the wall into play and catching them. I don't think Andruw Jones was a better defender than Torrey Hunter. Was he a better home run hitter? Well, yeah. Does that put him in the Hall of Fame ahead of Torrey Hunter? Was Torrey Hunter a better average hitter? Yeah. I think they're equal. But Andruw Jones has that 400 and some odd home runs, and Torrey Hunter doesn't.
And, to your point, too, I mean, he really did have a lot of gold gloves. 9, Torrey Hunter. That's a lot of gold gloves right there. 5-time All-Star. I'm going to have to look at his case a little bit. I think I asked you about this before, but I want to follow up now that we have the results of 2023. So my good friend Rick Hummel, I ask you this. I was reading a lot of stuff, and I was taking note. There seemed to be expressed respect for Mark Burley, and it makes me wonder whether he could be one of these guys that just kind of hangs around a little bit, and then maybe the ballot gets a little thinner, whatever the reason, and all of a sudden he starts to make real progress. Could you see a case building for him over time?
Yeah, this is he did better this year, I think, than the previous years. He went down the year before, and he almost fell off. He went down to 5 or 6%, I think, before this year. I do. He had a perfect game and another no-hitter. He pitched 200 innings in a season in succession, double-figure times. I don't have that number in front of me, but he missed by like a third of an inning in the last year he pitched with Toronto.
Yep.
Tremendous defensive player. He had Gold Gloves.
A lot of
them.
He
played for the World Series champion team in 2005 with the Sox. And
214 wins?
Yeah. Did he ever reach 90 miles an hour? Maybe not. So what?
Heck of a pitcher. Yeah, you're right. From 2001 all the way up until his final season, where you're right, like as you said, he missed 200 innings by a third of an inning. But from 2001 through 2014, he pitched at least 202 innings every one of those years and led the league, or led the majors, 245 and a third in 2004, and the year they won the World Series, 236 and 2/3. I mean, there's something to be said there. Said about a guy that, the way the art of pitching has changed. Innings are not a big deal anymore, it seems, but I think they should be a bigger deal.
Well, a guy pitches 200 innings now. He's an Iron Man.
Yeah,
I mean, Miklasz got to 200 last year. It was a big deal. It was a big deal for him, but it wasn't a big deal in the great, perspective of the game. He did it once, and this other guy did it 13 times.
Yeah, he went from 11% the first time. Second time on the ballot last year, he dipped down to 5.8%. Then he got back up to about 11 this year. Yeah, that's curious, but that's just kind of.
He needs to get into the 30s and 40s to have a real shot at this. He's at 11%. He's about where Roland started out, but Roland went up to, I think, 16 or 17 the next year, then into the 30s and 40s, and what, as we now know what happened. But at least he's on there still, and maybe some other voters will come onto the ballot, come into the voting pool that saw him play and say, hey, look at this 13 seasons of 200 innings in succession, or look at 214 wins. I mean, he's not going to outthrow anybody, but if all the pitchers pitched as he did, we wouldn't have all these speed-up rules that the commissioner has to introduce every year.
That's an excellent point. I never thought of it that way. Well, Commish, I'm trying to think what else to ask you about. I mean, there's always stuff to ask you about, but I have a feeling I'm leaving something out, and that's bugging me. I should make notes before we have our discussion. But I know what it was. I'm sorry. I know what it was. You've been on the scene for a very long time covering baseball in St. Louis, and I know you knew Harry Carey very well. I got to know Harry Carey through you, actually, and I know that you had a really good relationship with Skip Carey, and I know you've had a good relationship with Chip Carey. So I ask you because, you do have, you've always had like a good bond with all the Careys. So what's your reaction to Chip Carey becoming the new Cardinals TV play-by-play guy?
Well, I'm delighted. I'm assuming this is for more than just 1 year. I assume there's a multi-year deal in place here because he had a pretty good gig going with the Braves, for whom he worked for, a couple decades anyway, right? Almost anyway. And he was with the Cubs before that. It's wonderful. He's a great announcer and a great fellow. And I guess I might be one of the few people that have been out socializing with all three Careys at one point or another.
I don't know if I ever socialized with Chip's dad, but Harry for sure. And then I think Chip and I have sat down at a table a few times. But he's a wonderful guy, like you said. I mean, and you know how much this has to mean to him. This is. That there's family ties in his childhood, and it wasn't always easy, and for him to, I think, to be able to close the circle. He loves St. Louis, so I think this worked out well.
For the people who don't know the story, all three of those guys grew up in St. Louis. Went to other teams and so forth, but they started here. They started their lives here.
That's right. I mean, so I think it's a good day. I think it was a good day when they made that decision. I think they made a really good call, and and I hope he's happy here for a long time. I think he will be.
And I hope Danny Mac, is involved in some sort of process that will make him happy and all his many fans happy too. We don't know what that is just yet, but it'll come.
He's he's working hard. I know that, and I know that he the gravity of the situation is nothing he by any remote chance is taking lightly.
Right.
As a really good friend of his, it's a little tough in this regard because I know that he's really, really, really beating himself up, and which is to be expected because he knows he's screwed up and he's holding himself accountable. But there's a lot of people, man, that he's got a lot of support, and I value him as a human being. I don't excuse his mistakes, just like I don't excuse my mistakes. I did some really stupid things, but he's got a great heart. He helps a lot of people, and we don't even know, 75% of the stuff he does for local groups that need help.
Sure.
He's gonna rebound for sure, but what his next phase might be professionally, I don't know, and I'm not gonna bug him about it. I try not to bug him anyway, because he's dealing with a lot of things. But he's hard at work. Very hard at work, and very conscientious about where he is and what he's got to do. So maybe I shouldn't say that, but I just want people to know. This is hardly a thing that he is downplaying or doing a woe is me. It's none of that at all. He's pretty ticked off at himself, and he'll use that to be for more motivation and everything else. He'll be back. He'll rally. He's too talented, too good of a guy too.
I concur.
Kamish, I'll talk to you next week. Appreciate you very much. Oh, real quick, I thought of another thing. You don't have to necessarily go by the point spreads, although the Eagles are a 2.5-point favorite over the visiting Niners. And after the fluctuations all week, it looks like the Chiefs, it's all settled down where the Chiefs are favored by 1. You have a thought about the winners in those games?
I'm a little surprised that number with the Eagles is so small. They've been the better team than the 49ers all year long. And now the 49ers have 2 running backs who are banged up a little bit. They're going to play, but they were both in and out of that game last week, McCaffrey and his understudy. And I think that's going to be a big deal. Plus, the Eagles' defense will put some more sophisticated pressure on Purdy than maybe the Cowboys did. Cowboys held him down pretty well until that one long drive, which the Cowboys stupidly kept alive with 2 penalties and with on third down both times. That would not have been a 90-yard drive without their considerable help. So I don't think Purdy actually played that well last week. And the Eagles scored pretty much any time they want to with the weapons they have. I mean, Brown's a wonderful receiver. Hurts is an excellent quarterback. Their defense is tough. The Philly fans, well, they'll be ready. They've been waiting a long time for this game. And I think that spread being so low surprised me. I think Philadelphia will cover that number. And the other game, I just think the Chiefs have a better team than the Bengals do up and down the line. I think the Bengals' restocked offensive line is going to be under more pressure with Buffalo's defense. Once they lost Von Miller, wasn't that good anymore.
That's right.
And I think the Chiefs will put some more pressure on. So I think both favorites will win, and maybe not even in close games.
I think I'm going the other way.
Okay.
Because I think the both of these games are really hard. It was really hard for me to figure out certain things, but I feel I don't know the way the Bengals are playing. I just don't know that anybody can slow their roll, and I wonder if they're in the Chiefs' heads a little bit. Steve Spagnuolo, for example, terrific defensive coordinator who's considered one of the best blitz guys as far as creativity and scheme. He's tried everything to get Burrow off his mark, so to speak, and they can't get to him. They can't rattle him. They can't distract him. They can't get him into inaccuracy. I mean, he pretty much carves them up every time because he's a number 2 guy in the league, regular quarterbacks against the blitz. I mean, you blitz him at your own risk. So that sort of takes away something that is Spag's strength, if you will. However, that said, that's why this one's tough for me. We don't know exactly about Mahomes, although he's certainly better than he was a week ago. But Mahomes, you restrict, if he has to restrict some of his movement, I don't know how much they'll lose offensively. The Bengals also do a really good job covering tight ends. And you could look at the games Kelsey's had in these 3 in a row that they've lost. That's another thing that stands out at me. And there's just, when the Chiefs, the 3 games in a row that they've lost, they had big leads in 2 of them and a 7-point lead in another. But the bottom line is they were ahead after 3 quarters in all 3 instances. That tells me that obviously the Chiefs got the horses to beat them. There's no doubt about it. But for some reason, the game has just turned on them 3 times in a row, and I don't know what to make of that. You know what I'm saying, my man?
Yeah, I loved Cincinnati, but I had a little trouble trying to rationalize how they barely beat a crippled Baltimore team. If they don't fumble that ball, the snap at the goal line, Baltimore wins that game.
It's a really good point. I mean, Harbaugh, they're pretty good at gumming a game up and slowing it down. But you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, that was an unusually close call. If Lamar Jackson was playing, maybe you say, well, yeah, that's a good team, but not with the backup. That's for sure. So.
I think you're right about Mahomes being limited. I think he will be. I don't know how the Bengals offensive line will hold up or how hard it is to win in Buffalo and Kansas City back-to-back weeks. The Bengals have done it before. They did it last year doing stuff like that. But I just think that the field goal kickers are interesting because McPherson hasn't missed a field goal in the playoffs at all. But the other guy's got more range for the Chiefs. He'll miss some extra points once in a while, but he'll knock in a 65-yarder too if you need it.
I see. Listen, I have no confidence in thinking the Niners will win. But if I got to pick just to play the game, so to speak, they do have a path to victory that might reduce the importance of the quarterback. And you're right about it. They have a couple guys banged up, but they also use so many guys in the running game. I mean, they use wide receivers. You never know who's going to get the ball as a runner. Philadelphia has not been good stopping a run this year. It depends on what you want to look at, but I think average yards per rush against him is something like 17th in the league. I mean, they've gotten stampeded a few times. So I'm just saying that's a path. It seems to me that's something San Francisco can work on, maybe to reduce the quarterback being overly important. But yeah, this is going to be a huge test for him. They got 70 sacks, most by a team since 1989, and they're rated number 1 against the pass. So. Heck, why did I take the Niners again?
I don't know. Philadelphia's basically had, 3 or 4 weeks off. I mean, the Giants didn't get much opposition last week, and then they had 2 or 3 games at the end of the regular season when they played the reserves and almost beat Dallas with Gardner Minshew playing, for Pete's sake. And then they had a game with Washington they weren't very good in, but they played pretty well last week, and they could have beaten the Giants by 40 if they wanted to.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I think they're both going to be great. I hope both of these games are great. But as always, well, first of all, it's always great talking to you, period. But I always have to remember, you're great to talk to about any sport. You keep up with all this stuff. It's amazing.
A big game for the Billikens tonight. They're not out of that thing. I mean, people talk about they have to win the league tournament. I don't know if they have to win either the league tournament or regular season. They got wins over Providence and Memphis State. Those teams are going to be in the tournament. A lot of those teams don't have wins like that.
Well, if they do nothing except keep winning games, I agree with you. And there's no real reason why they should. How do I phrase? There's no reason why they should. I'm going to call something up real quick. Why they should lose a game for a while? I mean, if you look at who they're playing, they got Davidson tonight. It's probably close, but they should win. And if you go by these projections of Ken Pomeroy, and I pay attention to them because he's got a really good record with these projections. The Billikens are projected to win their next 4, then lose at Dayton, and then win 4 more in a row after that. Now, these are only projections, but his projections have been, with SLU anyway, his projections have been spot on this year. So They're going to keep rolling up wins.
They ran the season with Dayton, I think, here. But
they do.
They got VCU, which is tied for the lead, too, coming in next Friday. They absolutely have to win that game.
Yeah.
They can split with Dayton, but they got to beat VCU.
I mean, they've turned their season around, and they're having some people step up to fill in for some people that have been hurt, banged up, not playing well. So, Coach Ford's got this thing going a little bit. So, but you're right, absolutely a big game. In fact, the Ken Pomeroy model projection system, he's got SLU with a 55% chance of winning the game, but a very tight finish, which wouldn't surprise me. But as long as they win, I'm good.
Well, Davidson traditionally knocks them out of the water with the three-point shooting. That over the years they've lost a couple times over there to lesser teams than this one.
Yeah, I'm going to see where they are. You know what? It's funny you say that because you're right. Historically, they've been dynamite. This year, not so much. Yeah. I hope they don't heat up from the three.
You're right.
All right, my man. Take care. We'll talk next week.
You got it.
That's my dear friend and longtime colleague, Rick Hummel. Jim Hewer, I've told you this before. I said it briefly on the air just now. Like, all the times on the road with him, those quiet times you're just like two guys, two sports writers hanging out, talking about other sports, not just baseball. And I had no idea how he could keep up with everything. I mean, it was just unbelievable. You could have a damn, game where, Calgary's playing Atlanta, and you say, well, what do you mean Atlanta? That's when they had a team, right?
Yes.
And no one's paying attention to either one of those teams. Totally nondescript, right? And he would sit there and give you 3 minutes on, like, why he thinks Atlanta's going to beat Calgary. And I'm like, what do you do? Is this all you do? You, like, stay up all night and you just, like, study every game on the schedule? It seems like he does.
He is amazing.
He's like a savant, and I mean that as a extreme positive. He's a savant. It's amazing. I can't remember a stat that I looked up, an hour ago. And he's breaking down some obscure NBA game. I don't.
It is amazing. Well, we got a couple texts that loved his sandpaper remark.
That was very good. And he listen, I trust his opinion on Ken Boyer. And I'm going to start to get into this a little bit. I don't think there's a damn thing I can do to influence the process because I'm not on a committee and they wouldn't listen to me probably anyway. And I know Kamish is fighting a good fight, so we'll see. But, yeah, Ken Boyer is underappreciated. And I was doing a little work last night, and there's so many great things about his career. So we have to dig into that a little bit.
He's an interesting guy because, like, growing up here in St. Louis, Bernie, I never watched him play. I never really got an appreciation for much other than a few people. Oh, he's a really good player. I go, but how good? I didn't know. And when I look up numbers, I go, well, they're pretty comparable to Ron Santo. They're, and those are the two guys that I've always have heard. Those guys are neck and neck. Who's in, who's out. And then when Ron gets in, it's like, well, then Boyer gets in, da-da-da-da-da-da. And the one thing and I'd be curious your thoughts on this, is when you look at players of a different era, especially when you go back that far, and I hear, I don't know, let's just throw out a term OPS plus kind of.
Yeah.
And I go, the game was so different then, I think sometimes you can't always just go by the numbers we're valuing today. Because I think RBIs back then were so much more important than they are in today's game, just because of the way the game is managed and the way ball clubs were put together back then. The game was played differently back then. That's a simple thing, a smaller thing, but I just think sometimes I don't know what the right word is. You got to take into consideration at that time, in that era of the 60s, the game and the value of what was or I should say the aspects that were valued in the game were different than the ones we're looking at today. And I hope those don't get lost in the mix.
Well, I think
players.
I think players today value RBI. I think I think it's a lot of the wonky guys, and I'm wonky up to a point. I draw the line at RBIs. RBIs are very important, but I don't think it's like RBIs have statistically declined.
Okay.
And a lot of it has to do with the hard thing for me about comparing eras. When you I mentioned briefly, talking about I'm trying to think what I was talking about as far as like making this point. Oh, that if you look, there's a lot of big name center fielders in the Hall of Fame, pure center fielders, huge names, some of the biggest names to ever play the game. But they were all elected, not all of them, I'm sorry, most of them, predominantly elected, I mean, in ancient times, so to speak. And is that fair to center fielders that came along later? Jim Edmonds included. Like, when you look at the center fielders that were elected way back when, and all of these guys were giants of the game. I mean, these guys were immortals. They were the best of the best. And you're not going to find – Ken Griffey was one, but you're not going to find guys that have played in more recent times sort of being able to stand among them. Now, the Grouches, who won about 18 people in the Hall of Fame, will say, well, that's the way it should be, you know. And to that I say, quit being so close-minded and quit being so bogus and quit being so stupid about failing to understand how the game has changed. You cannot take the standards established by those guys and hold the younger players against it because the game's changed dramatically. Did they change the game? No, they didn't change the game. But in their system, certain things front office has put a premium on that the old-timers, who were great players, never had to worry about. And so it's kind of stupid to compare players of the last 20, 25 years against the guys who played center field in Joe DiMaggio's time and May's time, you know?
Yes.
It just doesn't make any sense. So you try to, you know, I zone in more and more on, let me evaluate first how a certain player compares to his peers, guys that he played the game at the same period in history, guys who he competed against, may have been his teammates. Let's see how he rates among his classification, and then we can talk about the legends of the game. I mean, this would be like in other words, what you're going to take some guy that, and I'm trying to think of a name and I can't, but you're going to take some guy that's come along, you know, over the last 20 years, maybe other than Ichiro or something like that, 25 years, and you're gonna say, well, he can't get in the Hall of Fame. He this guy didn't have a career that Stan Musial had. Well, no kidding, Branch Rickey. But if that's your standard, again, you'll have 9 people in the Hall of Fame, maybe 19. But also, you know, you have to also, there's so many other things to recognize. What about the fact that till 1947, this was an all-white sport, so players at that time never had to compete against people of color, who, as we know, some of the best players in the history game were people of color, you know? And, you know, on the other hand, maybe players of the post-expansion era have it easier per se because there's not as many teams. There's more teams now, so in theory, the talent level's diluted. I mean, I'm not taking a stand on it's like, well, those guys that played then were much better. I'm just saying that's really naive because one thing about baseball, there have been so many different eras, and everybody wants to cherry pick the era that they either hate or the one that they believe in and disregard everything else. I'm saying that's just really stupid, you know? The dead ball era. So what are you going to do? You're going to because the ball was made in a way where it just killed offense was so the top players of the game offensively, you know, you're going to say, well, they weren't as good as, you know, that guy wasn't as good as Harmon Killebrew or whatever. How can you do that? When Killebrew played, the ball was flying out of the ballpark. In the dead ball era, it wasn't. So how do you even start to compare the two? You know? So it's very, very complicated. The problem I have is people want to make it really simple. So, well, you didn't get to 500. Yeah, I'm not considering you. He didn't get to 3,000 hits. He's gone. You know, it's just stupid because the way players are used now because of front offices is just a whole different thing. And that's why I try to keep open-minded to all of this. You have to. What about ballpark sizes? What about ballpark dimension? What do you think about what about travel now? You think it was easy to hit when you're going from Cleveland Or New York to St. Louis, back and forth on trains all the time? How do you think is that good for your hitting? Or your pitching, for that matter? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to take into. I just thought I'd ask you that because I think sometimes some people, well, he didn't do this. Well, the game was managed differently. The game was played differently.
That's why
and
OPS.
It's both ways, though, too. People look at modern times, too, and go, like you just said, we're looking at Jim Edmonds' numbers. Well, yeah, he didn't hit 500 home runs and get 3,000 RBIs, but the game he played was different than the one they played in the 60s. So.
The other thing, too, you mentioned OPS Plus, but that's the great thing about OPS Plus because it neutralizes stats no matter what era a guy was in. Like, in other words, they look at how many runs were scored overall that year. Was it one of those years where the ball was hepped up? And it's pretty obvious. What about the people that play half their games at Coors Field or Cincinnati or some of these other places that are totally pro-hitter? Those stats, a guy's a good hitter, but the stats are so inflated, you're like, well, what's the reality? Well, what they do, again, they look at park and league effects, and they got a really good formula for it, and they neutralize the stats. So you have a better way of understanding, okay, what's real and what's inflated. Or conversely, in a year where they fiddled with the ball and runs are harder to come by and all this other stuff, the specialization of relief pitchers, all this other stuff, and they can the OPS Plus will actually be fairer to a hitter in a year where offense was down everywhere. Not because the hitters were bad, but because of the baseball and other factors. That's another thing. We talk about, well, hitters back then did this. Okay, they did that. But how many managers then tell me how many relief pitchers were prominent in the game. Tell me how many specialists were prominent. And by the way, for my fellow old-timers listening to this, you don't have to like the fact that games change, but when you're at a time where managers would not take a starting pitcher out of the game no matter how damn tired the guy was, even when he was out of gas. So hitters would have like 4 or 5 at-bats against a guy who's getting progressively worse. Nowadays, forget about that. Nowadays, you've got 98 miles an hour coming out of the bullpen. You got different looks. You got people throwing splitters and cutters. And, Ted Williams even used to say, I'm damn happy I never had to hit a slider. So now for hitters, a lot of this stuff is a lot more difficult. You don't get to beat up on tired starting pitchers, right?
Not
so
anymore.
That's why it's really, really kind of just foolish to even try to compare. You're just not going to get very far because this game has evolved so many times, right?
Yes, very much so. It's fascinating when you really sit down and think about it. So,
and you know what I like about OPS Plus? I'll give you an example. I'll shut up.
No, that's fine.
I want to talk football, but I need to
we
take
do get
a
a break. Yeah, you're right.
You look at Paul Goldschmidt. He played in Arizona, right? That ballpark, notoriously hitter-friendly, right? And I'm not maligning anything he did there, but the numbers had a little extra juice to them. Same with Nolan Arenado, obviously, at Coors Field. But when you use OPS Plus and you neutralize whatever ballpark advantage a hitter had, because obviously in that environment, like a Coors Field, everybody hits more home runs, they hit more doubles, extra base hits, they score more runs. It's just like a built-in advantage that's not necessarily fair. Same with it back then anyway, the ballpark in Arizona. So if you look at Goldie and Arenado, Paul Goldschmidt this past season had the best year of his career offensively because OPS Plus, the neutralization of the statistics to make him a more fair reading. He had his highest OPS Plus he's ever had in his career. And that's because they took the ballpark effects into account. Now, isn't that the right thing to do? Isn't that the just thing to do? Nolan Arenado, best season of his career offensively. When you take away the Coors Field cotton candy and the freebies, right, and all the cheap home runs and doubles, it doesn't mean that the people who hit there were bad hitters or frauds, although some of them were. Dante Bichette. It means that Vinny Castillo. It means that you can see if when things are neutralized, just to give you a fair reading of stuff. You take away all that artificial inflation. When Nolan Arenado puts up the numbers he did at Busch Stadium in St. Louis, and then OPS Plus has a way of explaining why it was a better season. It was a better season than what he did at Coors Field, because it's much more difficult to put up numbers at Busch Stadium than it is at Coors Field, right?
Yes.
I think that's a beautiful thing. But I guarantee you, probably 70% of the people listening are thinking, this gobbledygook. I don't care about all that stuff. Okay. All right. So get back to me the next time maybe a Cardinals player or someone else doesn't make the Hall of Fame because you didn't recognize the full value of his offense because he plays in a pitcher's park. Okay. Don't want to hear any complaints.